Welcome you all joining us. We're glad to have you, glad to be a part of this conversation. Whether you're watching this live or you're viewing it later, we believe this to be a significant conversation that's happening in our country today around the issues of race relations and its many manifestations, and we're glad to be a part of that. I am the Reverend David Wiggs, Senior Pastor at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This lecture is part of our 59th annual Barton Clinton Gordey Lecture series, in which we bring a renowned leader to Tulsa to share with us their wisdom and insights on any number of issues that are important in our church and society. This year, we are exploring the context of this broader race conversation, but focusing on the role of Christianity in the United States and the role the church and church leaders have played and how race relations in our country have been structured and conducted, and what we can do to improve on those relationships. To deepen our understanding, we have with us today the distinguished Dr. Robert P. Jones. Dr. Jones has become one of the foremost researchers and thinkers in this area, as he has brought overlooked history to light along with his profound analysis and insights. He has been featured in national publications across several national media outlets, as well as on television. Dr. Jones is CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, which he established in Washington, D.C. in 2009. Dr. Jones earned his Ph.D. from Emory University in religion after completing a Master of Divinity degree at a Christian seminary. He has written a number of books, the most recent published last year. As one commentator put it after reading this most recent book entitled White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, he said, Jones is a rare and indispensable voice in our public conversation about religion because he combines painstaking data analysis with a sure moral sense. Or this from the jacket cover. Drawing on history, public opinion surveys, and personal experience, Robert P. Jones delivers a provocative examination of the unholy relationship between American Christianity and white supremacy, issuing an urgent call for white Christians to reckon with this legacy for the sake of themselves, their Christian faith, and the country. So I read the book and thought we have to have this guy come and share more with us. He can help us build better race relations in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2021, as we approach this terrible anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Because of the pandemic, we are doing all the sessions via technology, and at the end of the session today, we will give you more information so you can access all of them. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Robert P. Jones as the 59th Barton Clinton Gordey Lecturer. Dr. Jones, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much, Reverend Wiggs. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Just a little pained that I can't be there with you all in person, but I'm happy that we're able, through the miracles of modern technology, to kind of be with you virtually today.
Great to have you. Fire away.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here this morning. It's in here. I'm in Washington, D.C. We have, it sounds like, very similar weather. It's very white and icy outside. The snow is finally, the sun is finally peeking out the window for the first time in about a week. So I'm happy to see that. But thank you for having me this morning and for taking time out of your Saturdays to have this important conversation. I'm especially honored to be with you during this important time in the life of your city and in the life of Boston Avenue Church as well. Because especially the 100 days of reflection that Boston Avenue Methodist Church is leading up to the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's a difficult journey to remember a troubling and awful time in your community's past. I think it's appropriate that we're having this conversation during the liturgical season of Lent. As in this season, Christians imitate Jesus' withdrawal into the wilderness for 40 days. So Jesus does this to get kind of clarity of mind, to remove himself from the day to day, to get a different perspective. Yearly, in this time in the liturgical calendar, Christians follow the similar practice. So it's a sober time. but it's also a time of preparation, a creative, a time of kind of creative realignment where we think about how we want to readjust the trajectory of our lives and anticipate, and it's a time of anticipation, of healing and new life and resurrection. I feel like that in many ways is the sense that brought me to the book and to really writing the book, this sense of trying to see and remember. In fact, the first two chapters of the book are actually called Seeing and Remembering. That kind of how can we deal with this moment of reckoning around racial justice in the country, and one that has come time and time again in our country's history, but is here again with us now. How can we take this time to be a time of self-examination and soul searching? So I'm going to begin really with a fairly challenging quote from James Baldwin, which is where the title "White Too Long" comes from. And I think the context for this quote, just so you can kind of hear it in the world in which Baldwin was writing it, he writes this in early 1969. It's just a few months after Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy have been assassinated. And he's writing it in a moment, I think, of despair after these awful events himself. And I think mostly despairing that even not only during Dr. King's life and work, that white Americans overall did not respond en masse in the way that he had hoped they would. And even with the assassination, there was not a great outcrying, particularly among the white and white Christian community. So he's writing, I think, with this kind of, I think disappointment and almost despair in his voice. But this is the word that he has to say. And again, this is from a New York Times op-ed just a few months after King's murder. I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs, and an intolerable violation of myself. Now, for those of you who, like me, are white and Christian, this is a very, very challenging set of words to hear. And I think, what often happens when we hear what is essentially an indictment of inaction, of apathy among the kind of white community and white Christian community in particular, there is a kind of defensiveness that immediately swells up, right? And I think one of the great openings of Lent is that it helps us find space to sit with these challenges in ways that I think we're very ordinarily able for them to kind of bounce off. So I think one challenge I think to put in front of us, given the moment we're at in terms of racial reckoning in the country in general, reckoning with racial justice issues, this leading up to the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre that occurred in 1921, that we take this time really to be a bit uncomfortable and to kind of sit with and to kind of use it as a mirror or a reflection, use like an indictment like this, the kind of reflection on what happened 100 years ago, and to kind of allow this to create a space in us, I think, that is often not there, to kind of reflect back our image to us and our history to us in perhaps a way that we haven't seen before, with an eye for what this means for what our responsibilities are in the present. So I think that's kind of just setting the table here. I'll tell you, just give you a little bit of about the book and the kind of overview of it, and then I'm going to give you also some data for where that tells us not only where we've been, but where contemporary American attitudes are today. So the book itself is a blend really of memoir and social science and history, kind of a three-legged stool. The memoir piece is, I began the book with a sentence that has the word I in it. I end the book with a sentence that has the word us in it. I write about we white Christians. That's the phrase I use throughout the book. It's very much a book I needed to write really for myself as a white Christian, to try to understand my own family story. And move it up through to into the present. The social science piece, in my day job at Public Religion Research Institute, I'm looking at demographic data and public opinion data around religion, attitudes around race, kind of on a day-to-day basis. So I've kind of brought that into the story as well. And then history, that one of the things going on in Tulsa this year is retelling a history that's been told from one perspective and giving a different lens on that history. And so I think that's often what the book is about doing as well, is kind of retelling a history that's been told really from one perspective and trying to kind of see it through a different lens. Overall, the book tells the repressed and hidden story of a centuries-long entanglement of white supremacy and American Christianity. And it tries to examine how these fault lines we're seeing in this current moment, how that history, a better understanding of that history and that entanglement explains our current moment and this moment of reckoning that we're experiencing in the country. It makes a fairly strong argument, but based in historical data and contemporary data. And the argument is that really that Christianity's role as a cornerstone of white supremacy in the country has been largely overlooked. When you hear the words church and white supremacy, or church and civil rights, I think people immediately think of African American churches that played these roles of kind of hubs of organizing during the civil rights movement. But very few people think about the massive resistance to civil rights, for example, the role that white churches played in that massive resistance to civil rights, and the work of kind of upholding a closed white supremacist society. And so I tried to bring some of that out in the book. And looking at both the history and the contemporary public opinion data, I really come to this conclusion that we white Christians have not just been complacent or complicit. I think even the critical histories, that's really where they often stop, that there was a kind of complacency or maybe a complicity. But what I'm arguing is that really is, as the nation's dominant cultural power through most of its history, it is white Christians have constructed and sustained a project of perpetuating white supremacy that has framed the entire American story. Now I want to say a little bit about the word white supremacy, because I think that we often have a very narrow understanding of what that word means. So we immediately think of, for example, a kind of black and white image of the KKK setting fire to a cross, for example. And that is certainly part of what I mean, and sort of the worst expressions of what that term means, but it is not really what the term encompasses. And I'm going to borrow a term here from an African-American scholar at Princeton, Eddie Glaude, who actually has a great recent book called Begin Again about James Baldwin as well. So I would kind of recommend that as reading to all of you. But he says that what we really need to understand is what he calls white supremacy without all the bluster, right? So not just sort of those images that we cast back into black and white images, 100 years ago. So certainly part of what we'll be reflecting on in Tulsa is, something that happened 100 years ago. That for sure is an expression of white supremacy. But we too often kind of disconnect that with its legacy and continued presence, in the present. So if we think about the way in which white supremacy, for example, has restricted access to jobs, to schools, to college, to loans and housing, to healthcare, mass incarceration in prison, unfair treatment by police and the courts. Even in this past year, you could see it in the unequal impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic in persons of color versus white populations as well. And and this is true not just in Tulsa, right, but in virtually every major city in the country. I did just a quick look at some stats in Tulsa to kind of think about how do we see this on the ground today. And like most American cities, Tulsa remains highly segregated. So North Tulsa, for example, home to about 17% of Tulsa's population, but 41% of Tulsa's Black population. And many of those census tracts in North Tulsa are over 80% African American. Those communities in North Tulsa have tend to be poorer, higher rates of unemployment, lower life expectancies as well. They experience more frequent, more lengthier police stops and have higher arrest rates than the rest of the city. So just noticing these things, and you could do this in virtually every city in the country. We see these things that are right in front of us. We tend to kind of, I think those of us who are white, I think tend to kind of read it and say, oh, well, it's just the way it is, without a kind of firm understanding of the direct line that can be drawn to the way that white supremacy has acted in our laws and our policies, and yes, even in our churches, to keep our cities segregated with this end. And I think this is what Eddie Glaude means, particularly about white supremacy without all the bluster. And this is the definition that's really come home to me, is that what we're really talking about here is the lie that white lives are more valuable and should be more valuable than all other lives, than Black lives, than Native American lives, than Latino lives. It really is about privilege and value. And I don't mean privilege in the sense of a kind of light sense, but a kind of leg up in who gets what jobs, who gets to go to what schools, who gets which loans, who gets to live in unpolluted areas of the city or safer areas of the city. All of these were very deliberate policies that were meant to protect white lives at the expense of others. So how do we deal with this legacy? How do we kind of come to it? And so if we really see this, this commitment to white supremacy has been with us really since the founding of the country, and that Christianity has really been the most formal, powerful voice legitimizing this worldview, that we really have to wrestle with the fact that the legacy of this unholy union still lives in the DNA of white Christianity today. And one of the most notable things here is that we find that this is true not just among kind of white evangelicals in the South, but among white Christians who were among the mainline Protestant denominations, such as the United Methodist Church, living kind of in the Midwest, and also among white Catholics in the Northeast. And I'll unpack that a little bit better, but this is a sort of issue that we see in kind of white Christianity writ large. Just a bit about kind of me before I jump into the data. I mentioned that I began the book with I and kind of end the book with an us. But really, this is the book that I needed to write to wrestle with my own family story here. So I grew up mostly in Jackson, Mississippi, as a Southern Baptist. And I was that kid. I was at church all the time, literally 5 days a week, kind of when I was part of the youth group, very, very active. I went to a Southern Baptist college. I went to a Southern Baptist seminary, drank very deeply at this well. And just one quick little insight, I think, into how deep this history has been hidden and how little reckoning there has really been with this history, is that it wasn't until I was in my 20s and I was sitting in a seminary class. So I was in a graduate program at a Southern Baptist seminary that I had a history professor really finally tell me the true story of the founding of our denomination, right? That is that in 1845, Baptists in the South split off from Baptists in the North over the issue of slavery, and explicitly to make enslaving other people on the basis of the color of their skin compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Like that was really the founding of our denomination in 1845. Not coincidentally, since I'm speaking here among a lot of Methodists, it is the same year that the Methodist Church split, also in 1845, and where the Methodist Episcopal Church South was formed. So all across the South, you have the Southern Baptist Convention being founded, the Methodist Episcopal Church South being founded. Both of those splits happened in 1845. And it is in fact, the momentum generated by these church splits over slavery that actually feeds into the political secessionist movement. I remember they lay the groundwork for the real political secessionist movement that leads to the Civil War in the early 1860s. And so I think even that history, I think, has been largely overlooked. That this kind of theological undergirding of a white supremacist worldview that was overtly defending not just the supremacy of whites, but the version of chattel slavery that this country had developed. I mean, that is the legacy. And even after the churches kind of merged, for example, well, the Southern Baptist Church has never reunited with its Northern brethren. That's what the Southern and Southern Baptist still signifies. The Methodist Church did reunite in the 1830s, but it's in the 1930s, but it's noticeable or notable that when that happened, that all of the African-American congregations were sequestered and segregated into one kind of made up district called the Central jurisdiction. In other words, so the rest of the church is organized geographically, but rather than allow African-American churches to join kind of their local districts, they were actually all segregated into basically a gerrymandered kind of made up district called the Central jurisdiction. And that was done really deliberately to dilute their power and the denomination. And that configuration stays in place until 1968. Actually, the year I was born is how long it stays with us and finally gets undone. So the book is really about trying to kind of pull up some of this neglected history to have us face it and to find the courage, really, hopefully help us find the courage to face it, to really understand how this centuries-long commitment to the social order that protected and nourished and valued white lives at the expense of Black lives, how it became incorporated in the very fabric of American Christianity. And again, not just the Southern branch, of which I'm a part, but through all of white Christianity, and really what that means for us today. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to walk you through just a few slides that get to a little bit of how this is still with us today, because it's one thing to kind of look at the history, but another thing to ask, how is this with us today? So let me pull that up. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to start with just a few questions. One of the things I was trying to figure out in the book is how can we understand the influence of Christianity on white attitudes? And so looking across a range of questions, what I did is I looked at really 4 different groups among white Americans. That is, I looked at the 3 major subgroups of white Christianity, that is white evangelical Protestants, anchored by the Southern Baptists in the South, white mainline Protestants. The largest denomination there is the United Methodist Church, along with like the Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church USA, and others, and then white Catholics, which have their own trajectory, kind of separate from the Protestant world. And then also looking at whites who were not Christian, right? Whites who claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. And I was really interested in looking at how do attitudes around race, racial justice, systemic racism impact, or how do they look across these different groups, and how do they compare to the attitudes of African Americans? So the first one, just to give you an example, I look at 15 different questions in the book and combine them into an index, but I'll give you a couple to give you the flavor here. So this is an agree or disagree question. Generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. What I'm showing you here is a percent of each of these groups who disagree with that statement. In other words, who think that basic systemic racism based on the past slavery and discrimination is not really a factor today. So you'll see there's no group who thinks this more than white evangelical Protestants. About 2/3 of them disagree with this statement. But note that white mainline Protestants, again, this is the group that United Methodists are a part of, more than 6 in 10 also disagree. Catholics, who have their own history of discrimination in this country, interestingly enough, are also a majority territory. But if you look at whites who claim no religious affiliation, you'll see there's like this 20-point gap between white Christian groups and those who are not Christian, and they look much closer to the attitudes of African American Protestants, African American Christians on this question. And this pattern is one. I'll show you a couple of other slides, but basically this pattern is the one that we see, that basically there are 3 white Christian groups tend to be on one side of the question. White Americans who are not Christian tend to be much closer to African Americans. So if you ask this question, if you take your average white person and you add Christianity to their kind of worldview, what tends to happen is they move further away from their African American brothers and sisters rather than closer here. And I'll take you through a couple of other ones. You'll notice the same pattern here. If you didn't see anything else, the pattern of the bars looks roughly the same. There's another question, whether people who agree that Confederate monuments or flags are more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism. Again, white evangelical Protestants, white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, all 7 in 10 or more, believing these are more symbols of Southern pride than symbols of racism, while white religiously unaffiliated non-Christian Americans down around 4 in 10, a little more on the monuments question, but on the Confederate flags question down around 4 in 10, African Americans down around 15 to 20% on those questions. One that's been, right in the headlines with us this past year since the murder of George Floyd last spring and the protests across the country for racial justice is this question of treatment of African Americans by police. We asked this question, do you think the killing of unarmed African Americans by police are isolated incidents, or do you think they're part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans? What I'm going to show you here are patterns of people who believe they are isolated incidents, right? And here again, you see the same pattern. White evangelical Protestants much more likely to say they're isolated incidents, but white mainline Protestants, white Catholics right there, just under 60%, white unaffiliated Americans down under 40%, and African American Protestants down under 20%. So, I took, again, 15 different questions and combined them into one big scale to just make sure I wasn't just cherry picking numbers. Remarkably, all of those questions correlated. They were essentially about systemic racism in one way or the other, correlated very, very highly with one another. In other words, the way you answered one was highly predictive of the way respondents would answer another one. And you can see this pattern here again. These are the frequency distributions. The vertical lines are the median point in each of these distributions. And again, basically you just see, if we put this on a scale of 1 to 10, for example, that white evangelicals score about 8 out of 10, with 10 being holding kind of more racist attitudes, denying the existence of systemic racism, but white mainline Protestants and white Catholics scoring about 7 in 10, a little bit lower, but there, and then white unaffiliated scoring down around 4 in 10 on the scale. So exactly the same pattern you saw on those individual questions in the composite one. And here, this chart is maybe a little complex, but basically what it's showing is I wanted to make sure that these weren't just correlations. In other words, there might be a lot of other explanations for the correlation between white Christian attitudes and or white Christian identity and attitudes on racism. So what I did is I put them in a statistical model and I tested to see and held constant all kinds of alternative explanations. So for example, you might wonder, well, maybe it's about partisan identity. Maybe that white Christians are more likely to identify as Republican, and maybe it's politics rather than religion that this is about. Maybe it's about education level, or maybe it's about living in an urban place versus a rural place. Perhaps it's about the region of the country, gender. Maybe it's more about that. Anyway, I tested a whole range of these things, and even holding all of these things constant. What this chart basically says is that there is an independent connection between white Christian identity and holding more racist attitudes. And if you hold all these things constant, and you look at the shift from kind of moving from least racist attitudes to most racist attitudes, it increases the likelihood that you identify as white and Christian by about 20 percentage points, is really what these things are showing. And what you'll notice here is that once I control for all these other things, basically the differences between the white Christian groups mostly disappear. That longer line that you saw among white mainline Protestants does disappear once you control for partisanship and other things. But there still is this 20 percentage point increase in the likelihood, and this is the kind of predicted probability that you'll be a white Christian if you move from holding the least racist attitudes to the most racist attitudes on this index. And the other thing I'm just going to say here before I kind of move to the end in terms of data is that there could also be, an objection that says, well, maybe this is just about people who claim to be Christian but really aren't, right? Or they claim to be Christian but they're completely disconnected from churches. They don't hear sermons. They're not part of Sunday school classes or Bible studies or any other kind of Christian discipleship. So I did actually measure and control for religious attendance in this model as well. One of the, I think, most striking things I found is that among white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, church attendance makes no difference at all in terms of being more likely to hold more racist attitudes. So those who attend less frequently are just as likely as those who attend more frequently to hold more racist attitudes. But among white evangelical Protestants, the kind of world in which I grew up, it turns out that the relationship between being a white evangelical Protestant and holding more racist attitudes is actually stronger among those who attend church more frequently. That is, not only does church attendance not mitigate racist attitudes, it actually makes them stronger. And this is, again, controlling for all kinds of other factors. And there's a direct and predictive relationship here between higher church attendance among evangelicals and holding more and holding more racist attitudes. So I'm going to kind of move now back, stop sharing my screen and move back to just kind of closing out here. And we'll have some time, so make sure we have some time for questions. So clearly, we are at a crossroads in this country. If you paid attention this last year and the protests across the country, and as you all in Tulsa are looking, rightly, I think, to memorialize this terrible event in your city's history, that it is a moment that is ripe with possibility. I think I would say in my lifetime, I haven't seen really an opening to having these very difficult conversations the way that I have in the past year, particularly among white and white Christian congregations and groups. So I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. It's so important. I think it's no exaggeration to say that it's not just the future of white Christianity, but really the outcome of the American experiment that really is at stake here. I'd say that some things that have happened even since I finished the book, including this conversation that I'm a part of today, I think give me some real hopes. I can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A part if we want to go there. But I do think just the things that have happened on the ground, this kind of moment, I think that's ripe with possibility today, I think is just so important for us to seize. And as we're facing really this moment of reckoning on racial justice, it's one way of thinking about this is that the question is being called. Like it's where are we going to be? I think there was a moment in the civil rights movement where Martin Luther King, Baldwin, and others were kind of pressing the white community to stand up, which it largely did not. But today, all across America, we have another great cloud of witnesses that is gathering to see whether we white Christians can finally find the humility and the courage and the love to face the truth about our long relationship with white supremacy. As we see these monuments to white supremacy falling across the country, we have these moments of reflection like the one you all are involved with. The real question in front of us is whether white Christians will take the lead in dismantling the white supremacist worldview that we legitimize to erect many of these monuments and to kind of paper over this history in the first place. So there is a kind of outward responsibility here, but I do want to end on this note that this is not really a call to altruism. And I think this is something that I frankly missed for most of my life. And I think things that's really very easy for white Christians to miss. So we contemporary white Christians who've been baptized into a faith with white supremacy built into its DNA, we really have an opportunity here to confront these unsettling truths. And to do that, certainly one reason to do that is to help face and repair the damage that we caused to our African-American brothers and sisters in our history, in our communities. But the other reason is actually quite personal, and that is to salvage the integrity of our own faith and our own identities. here. I'll end with another insight from Baldwin. Baldwin characterized the civil rights movement as something that happened when, these are his words, a despised and oppressed group began to wake up to what had happened to them. And I think the question before us, particularly we white Christians, is whether we are going to have the courage and love and humility to wake up to what has happened to us. If we can do that, and I'll end here with Baldwin's words that I close with quite often, something Baldwin said 50 years ago: if we can find the courage and love to do that, we can end the racial nightmare, we can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world.
Great. Thank you so much. You do have a very enlightening chapter on how white supremacy shaped Christian teaching and preaching in America to support slavery without any ethical qualms, and how that's kind of the legacy of. Can you say a little bit more about the Christian leaders and the teaching and preaching and how that unfolded to support slavery?
Sure. I mean, it even goes back to even prior to, the Christianity that lands on our shores from Europe, kind of had this worldview built in. I think we've not been very reflective about that. As early as 1493, there was a papal edict. This is actually before the Protestant Reformation, so there were no Protestants at this time. This was the kind of Western Church. There was a papal edict that applied to the entire Western Church called the Doctrine of Discovery. And what this document said was, if kind of people coming from European countries, either kind of for political purposes or for missionary purposes, if they showed up and landed on the shores of a land that was not Christian, that they were authorized by the church to seize control of those people and those lands, right, in the name of Christianity and the kind of European country that they were representing. I mean, this fueled the entire colonization movement. There was it was seen to be divinely ordained, right, throughout. And then, in the American context, I mean, you don't have to look very hard to find sermon after sermon justifying slavery and the Confederacy as God's really divine plan for human society. Like, it was seen by many. I quote in the book this pastor named Basil Manley Sr., who was kind of one of the early architects of the break between the Southern and Northern Baptists. And he very clearly he saw the Confederacy, and he was actually there. He was holding the Bible for Jefferson Davis to take the oath of office, actually, as the president of the Confederacy. And in his prayers and in his journals around those events, I mean, he was just absolutely giddy that God's divine plan and arrangement for human society, which he saw as kind of, white Christians being in charge of everything and with enslaving other people as a natural and divinely ordained part of social order, right? That it was actually something that God was mandating and should be celebrated. I mean, it was just straight out in front of us. I think we kind of sweep those under the rug, so easily, but that's right there, right there, just a little bit under, under the page, if we just kind of look under it a bit.
Right. And I'll speak for myself, but I think this is probably reflective of lots of white Christians. We don't really know that history of the papal edict or the sermons or the support that was given in the 1800s across the country for this kind of thing, from churches, from pastors, from church leaders. That was all enlightening to me when I read the book. When you began to write the book, did you realize how much you were going to find in terms of Christians being such public spokespeople for white supremacy, for the Confederacy, for the building of the monuments, for Jim Crow, all that you document in the book? Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I think so. I kind of knew it was there, but I mean, again, the ease with which you can find it. I mean, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a trained historian, but it wasn't that hard to really just surface, these things. And like I said, I mean, I was raised in the church. I had a seminary degree, and it wasn't until was in my 20s, right, that I had any clue about my, this heritage. And I would, wager that most United Methodists don't really know the story of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, right, and how it came to be and what its history was, and what that legacy, continues to be today. So I think, yes, I was surprised at just how just under the surface it is, and then I think also I was a bit surprised at how intentionally under the surface it was rendered. Right. The fact that it's just unconscionable that my kind of white Baptist church growing up would have had nothing to say about that legacy. Right. I had Sunday school classes talking about Baptist identity. Right. And what did we talk about? We talked about baptism, right, by immersion. Right. And how you Methodists had it all wrong. Right. Right. Those were the kind of big controversies. But we had, literally nothing to say about our complicity in the civil rights movement, about our own churches being in a racially restricted neighborhood, about our own church having a policy against African Americans attending our church, resisting segregation after Brown v. Board of Education, and just none of that. It was rendered completely invisible.
Right. Now, early in the book, you do talk about the church being not only complacent or complicit, but kind of the dominant social institution that legitimized and fueled racism and segregation. Are you suggesting, when you talk about that this is even a larger role that churches played than the founders, like the people who wrote the Declaration or the Constitution? Are you saying the church is even a more formative institution than government in this way?
Well, there is the setting up of laws and policies, and then there is the legitimation of those laws, right? And so there are lawmakers who set these things up, and then there are civic and religious leaders that make them legitimate. And so what I would say is that, the role of kind of a dominant religious force in any society is to kind of provide a moral and religious justification for the way that things are, right? So that there's a sense that the society that we're living in is the right one that we should be living in, and that it kind of, quote unquote, makes sense based on our worldview. Now, what funded that worldview for nearly all of American history? It was white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism that funded, that legitimized that worldview, and certainly had white Anglo-Saxon Protestant churches taken anywhere near a majority stand against white supremacy, against slavery, those institutions, would have fallen fairly quickly. But it's the propping up and legitimizing of those things. The other thing I'll say here, it's important, I think, is that it was actually a distinction that became new to me in this book, is that I always kind of had white supremacy and slavery intertwined, or maybe white supremacy and Jim Crow intertwined in my mind. And the thing that I've become very clear about is that even as these representations of white supremacy fell, so slavery falls, the kind of ideation and the ideology of white supremacy lives on, right? That it finds another expression. So after the Civil War, it tears down Reconstruction, which is the first big movement for Black equality, and it stands up in its place segregation and Jim Crow in its place, right? It finds another way. When we get the Voting Rights Act, finally, the reason we need the Voting Rights Act is because all over the South, African Americans have been denied the right to vote, or even the access to the polls, often, kind of supported again in local communities, that worldview supported by white churches. And just to kind of bring it really home here, that after the Tulsa race massacre in 1921, the Tulsa World printed kind of contemporary ministers commenting on it, white ministers commenting on it, and to a person, they blamed the violence on the African American community. And Bishop Malzahn, I'm hoping I'm saying that name right, the kind of old, who was the Methodist bishop at the time.
Bishop Malzahn.
Malzahn, yeah, said but also blamed it on the African Americans and said, one thing we should make very clear to the Negro community is that social equality with whites is the worst possible thing for both the white and black man. Right. So just kind of putting it out there, legitimizing that kind of social hierarchy. Actually use the terms, it'd be like putting the bottom rail on top, to kind of to have, so this kind of sense of hierarchy very much defended from a Christian point of view.
Great examples. We've got several questions in the Q&A, so let me get to a couple of those. I'll just say to the whole group, several of the questions are about what can we do? What action can we take? Do we need to do reparations? We're going to deal with all those in future lectures, so I'm going to hold those for now. We'll pick those up and we'll give you the links for that in just a couple of minutes before we close. There was a question about, did you control for age differences in the statistical analysis?
Yes, I did. I failed to mention that, but yes, we did control for age, because one of the biggest differences between the religiously unaffiliated group is that it's younger on average. So it was really important actually to control for age, because otherwise you might just be measuring, kind of age difference between those who are affiliated and church going and those who aren't. But even controlling for age, all those stats that I showed you kind of reflect that control in place, even for age, and they still. So again, what I was trying to do is to make sure I was getting this independent relationship, and it is, in fact, the Christian identity piece, right? That is that accounts for this kind of 20-point difference that you saw there. Kind of 20 point more likely identifies white and Christian is pegged to that Christian identity piece.
There's a question about if people don't accept your data, is there a way to continue the discussion if people are kind of anti-science or anti-research, or say stats can say what you want? How do you continue a dialogue? Have you found ways to do that since the book was published?
Yeah, well, it's just kind of one piece of the puzzle. There's a way in which, and one of the reasons why I included as much history as I did in the book is precisely to give the data context, because if you're faced with this data on just kind of cold, I think, and I put the data chapter right in the middle of the book, right after kind of laid a lot of historical groundwork, you're kind of likely to think, well, God, how can that be? Right? How could that possibly be? It just baffles the mind if you're someone who grew up in a white Christian church, right? As I did. I mean, I would have that same reaction myself, I think, seeing it cold. But when you see the history, right, and you see this kind of continuous line, what really the question gets transformed from how can this be to how can this be otherwise, right? Given this history, right? So I think it's the fact that the history, the contemporary public opinion data, and the evidence on the ground, just the continued divisions we see in our cities, all point very clearly to the same conclusions. And I'll say this too, that one of the toughest things I think for I say this for myself, this is a very tough book to research and write. Right? There were times where I myself got defensive. Had to kind of put it down for a minute, but I think the thing that has kind of held me to it is actually thinking about my kids, right? And this, where I ended the lecture, so part of the resistance, I think, is because we think, okay, well, what is it going to require of me, right? And how do I deal with, what feels like an overwhelming realization, here. And I think that sense of being overwhelmed is a natural part of the process. And what I've been kind of encouraging people to do is just sit with it, right? And I think this is actually part of what Lent is about, is sitting with things that are very, very uncomfortable, that are painful, that evoke shame, that evoke embarrassment, these very difficult emotions, for us to deal with. But I do think there's a moment here, and thankfully we get invited into this space every year, but to kind of turn the mirror to ourselves, right? To kind of look as clearly as we can. And I would submit that the testimonies that we have from our African-American brothers and sisters are one of the ways we do that, right? We kind of see ourselves through their eyes, and we see ourselves in these really awful awful, embarrassing, shameful moments of history, right? But if we have the courage to face them, and I was kind of thinking about my kids, I've thought, I've got the whole Confederate history in my enslaving people in my family's history. I've got it documented, in wills and estates, and in a family Bible that goes back to 1815. I mean, it's all there, but and so when I have felt this kind of defensiveness, and wanting to quibble, I think this is one of the things that white people are really good at, is quibbling, with our kind of whataboutism, moment, just to kind of deflect the attention from the tough thing. I do think, that it's true that if we really take seriously our job of handing down a better faith to the next generation, it is a real work of courage, right? And a real work of faithfulness, to tackle these issues, right? And to be the generation that at least takes a huge step forward in weeding out these assumptions of white supremacy, and thinking about the faith that we're handing down to our kids. And one way I've kind of put it is like, I kind of came to the conclusion, look, I can kind of be loyal to those ancestors that are written in this family Bible, whose names for generations are down. I can be loyal to them, or I can be loyal to my kids on this issue, but I can't do both. And I'm going to choose, the future.
Great. All right. We're going to have to wrap it up there as we're coming toward the end of the hour. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Our communications director is going to put some links in the comments for you. The first two links are for the next two sessions with Dr. Jones. The next one that's available is American Christianity and Racism in America Today. So we looked at the history here this morning. We're going to look at more current things in the next one. And then the third one will be Possibilities for Racial Justice, Repair, and Reconciliation in American Churches. So we hope we'll post both of those. They're going to be available right at the end here. You can watch those today if you like. The third link is the registration to attend tomorrow's live panel, which will wrap up this weekend of discussion. It'll be a wonderful discussion with local Tulsa leaders, several panelists that will join us: the Reverend Dr. Robert Turner, Dr. Erica Townsend Bell, Gregory Robinson, the Reverend Dr. Gary Peluso Verdin, and the Executive Director from the Tulsa Historical Society, Michelle Place. So that's at 2:00. That'll be like this session, a live panel. The other two links are to pre-recorded sessions Dr. Jones and I have prepared for you. Then tomorrow at 11 a.m., Dr. Jones will be our preacher during morning worship. Of course, you can join us via Channel 8, the ABC affiliate here in Tulsa, or via the live stream. So we hope you can come to one or all of those. It's going to be an ongoing conversation. Several of the questions we did not get to, I can assure you we're going to cover some of those in the coming lectures. And then, of course, we have the live panel tomorrow at 2:00. We'll be talking specifically about Tulsa and what steps we need to take to build better race relations in Tulsa, Oklahoma today. So thank you, Dr. Jones. Thanks to all who've tuned in. We're so delighted you're a part of this Barton Clinton Gordey opening lecture, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone.